Good evening and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki, Sharma, Upadhyay. Let's get started. It has been almost 4 months. We have been relentlessly covering the build-up around Ukraine's borders. WION is the only network from India to have travelled to Ukraine and reported from ground zero. And while we were there, we were asked just one question all the time. Will there be a war? Will Russia indeed invade Ukraine? Well, we did not have a clear answer then, but tonight it looks different. Russia could invade Ukraine as soon as tomorrow. I'm not the one saying this. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says tomorrow, the 16th of February, could be the day of invasion. It's a big claim to have been made by a president. But what's the basis for it? Will there be war? Russia's activities in one contested region have raised fears. Many fear Moscow could begin the offensive from Donbass in eastern Ukraine. One key ally is quietly backing Moscow, and that is China. Beijing can keep the Russian economy afloat in the event of Western sanctions. There is a clear shadow war over Ukraine now. 13 countries have ordered evacuations of citizens, including India. India has advised its citizens, its students, to leave Ukraine immediately. On Gravitas tonight, we'll bring you the latest assessments. Also on the show, Canada has declared a national emergency as weapons find their way to the protest convoy. 65% Canadians are blaming Prime Minister Justin Trudeau for making the situation worse. Justice has been hung out to dry in Parliament. A murderer is set to walk free 6 years after killing his own sister and social media star Qandeel Baloch. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan visited United Arab Emirates for the first time in a decade. We'll tell you why this visit is significant. And also on the show, we'll introduce you to the world's first digital candidate. A South Korean politician, a presidential candidate, has created a deepfake model of himself to appeal to young voters. Is this the future of campaigning? We will explore. We begin as always with Gravitas Global Headlines.
Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett arrived in Bahrain for the first ever official visit by an Israeli head of government to the Gulf state following the US brokered 2020 Abraham Accords. The Taliban have warned that it would reconsider its policy towards the United States if President Joe Biden did not reverse his decision to return half of Afghanistan's $7 billion deposited on US soil. Days after foreign ministers of India, the US, Australia and Japan met in Melbourne for a meeting, the White House has called India a driving force of the Quad and an engine for regional growth. Hundreds of journalists held demonstrations in Mexico to protest against the killings of 5 journalists this year, demanding justice and government action against the murders. The Ethiopian parliament has lifted a state of emergency imposed last November when Tigrayan rebels threatened to advance on the capital. However, no statement on the release of those detained under emergency provisions has been provided. Thousands of people took to the streets of Sudan to protest the October military coup. A former member of the ruling Sovereign Council was detained in the capital. The detentions have intensified in recent weeks as Sudan plunged into further turmoil with near-daily street protests. Pollution is contributing to more deaths globally than COVID-19, as per UN environmental reports, and is calling for immediate and ambitious action to ban some toxic chemicals. The mega drought that has parched southwestern United States and parts of Mexico over the last 2 decades is the worst to hit the region in at least 1,200 years, according to experts. 15-year-old Kamila Valieva has qualified for the second leg of the women's single skating event at the Winter Olympics. All eyes were on the Russian after she was cleared to compete, despite a positive dope test. She topped the qualifying chart and struggled to hold back the tears after her routine. 20-time major champion Novak Djokovic says he would rather miss out on Grand Slams than be vaccinated against COVID. In his first major interview since being deported from Australia earlier this year, the world number one told the BBC he was not against vaccination in general, but believed people had the right to choose whether they were jabbed or not.
Will Russia attack Ukraine tomorrow? That is the big question, and frankly the only question at the moment. Russia's drills are almost over. The US says an invasion is imminent. It could begin, quote-unquote, any time. Even Ukraine believes there could be war. Their president said Russia may attack on the 16th of February. That's tomorrow. So is Russia invading Ukraine tomorrow? Where are they getting this information from? You won't believe what the Ukrainian president said. He said he was just quoting some media reports. So much for military intelligence and what have you. In another instance, he's said to have been joking about an attack. Well, it's not a laughing matter anymore. These claims have led to panic. 13 countries have ordered evacuations. 39 countries have warned against travel to Ukraine. The latest on that list is India. India has advised its citizens, especially its students, to leave Ukraine. If the attack is indeed happening tomorrow, it may already be a little late in the day for such advisories. But is the attack happening? Let's tell you what's the update on the ground. There is more proof of expanding Russian deployments. New satellite images have come out. They were clicked in the last 48 hours. The build-up is indeed massive. In Belarus, in Crimea, and in western Russia, there are several large contingents of troops, attack helicopters, fighter jets, combat units, basically everything that you may need to launch an offensive. The Russians have all of it near the border with Ukraine. How many troops are we talking about? Here's what the latest estimates say. Russia has more than 60% of its ground forces deployed to the front. Most of them have been engaged in a drill since last week. But here's a twist in the tale. Russia also pulled back some troops today, and it did so publicly. Moscow officially announced this move. Some units in southern and western Russia were asked to return.
As the training comes to an end, the troops, as usual, will march back to their home stations. Units from the southern and the western military districts that completed their tasks already have started loading on trains and motor vehicles. They will start moving to their home bases. Individual units will march on their own in military columns.
Is this the first sign of de-escalation then? Well, Ukraine is skeptical. The Ukrainian foreign minister addressed the press today and he made two broad claims. Number one, the Russian escalation has been contained. And number two, he'll believe the claims of de-escalation when he sees it.
Russia constantly makes various statements. That's why we have the rule. We won't believe when we hear. We will believe when we see. When we see troops pulling out, we will believe in de-escalation.
Побачимо відведення, повіримо у деескалацію.
So for Ukraine, today's withdrawal does not count. Kiev wants a full de-escalation. In Moscow, though, a different kind of offensive is in the making. Lawmakers want Vladimir Putin, and by extension Russia, to recognize Luhansk and Donetsk as independent states. Now, these are two regions of eastern Ukraine controlled by separatists. Russia tried to capture them when it annexed Crimea. The offensive failed. But Moscow did manage to install puppet governments. Now, Russian lawmakers want them labeled as breakaway states.
Today, we do not trust the Kiev regime. Now it is out of control and impossible to reach agreements with them. Ukraine is now led by fascists, right-sector nationalists and supporters of Anglo-Saxon countries. By making this proposal, we do only one thing. We offer protection to the people.
The Russian Duma has voted in favor of this resolution. If Putin approves it, it will be a grave provocation for Ukraine, a step towards war. and Europe is hoping to avert it. Another leader landed in Moscow today, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. He met Putin. He got the same treatment as Macron, the same 20-foot-long white table and the extreme social distance. Just like Macron, the German leader refused to take a Wuhan virus test in Moscow, and his visit made virtually no progress. Scholz says Putin is ready to talk, but few are taking that claim seriously. NATO says it hasn't seen any serious withdrawal from Russia.
So far, we have not seen any de-escalation on the ground, not seen any signs of reduced Russian military presence on the borders of Ukraine. But we will continue to monitor and to follow closely what Russia is doing. And the signs coming from Moscow about a willingness to continue to engage in diplomatic efforts, that gives some reason for cautious optimism. But we will, of course, follow very closely what's happening on the ground and whether this is reflected in some real de-escalation of the Russian military build-up in and around Ukraine.
The US seems to agree. It is closing its embassy in Kiev. American diplomats are relocating to Lviv in western Ukraine. Washington says this is a temporary move. American citizens have been asked to move out immediately from both Ukraine and Belarus. The latest travel advisory says Russia could, quote-unquote, attack Ukraine any day now, and tensions are high in the region. For Americans in Belarus, the instructions are clear. Leave now. Why Belarus? Because it's a Russian ally, and Washington fears American citizens could be detained there. What about America's allies? The United Kingdom is singing the same tune. It says a Russian invasion is imminent.
We still believe that an invasion of Ukraine is very likely, and it could be imminent. We know the Russians are highly prepared, that they'll have the troops surrounding Ukraine, and they could do it in very short order.
Ukraine is observing a day of unity tomorrow. He says the threats of an invasion are just meant to scare them into submission. The next 24 hours and the next course of this conflict, in fact, will be decided not in Kiev, but in a region in eastern Ukraine, Donbas. The Russian parliament passed a proposal this evening. It asked Russian President Vladimir Putin to recognize Donbas as a republic. In other words, a territory governed by an elected representative. And this is a clear provocation. It is a threat of war. And I will tell you why. Donbas will determine what happens next in this crisis. This is the region we're talking about. It's a small region in eastern Ukraine. Here's where it's located on the map. Now, like you can see, Donbas adjoins the Russian border. It has been at war for years. 8 years to be precise. Donbas consists of two regions, Donetsk and Luhansk. Both are heavily industrialized. A war broke out in 2014 here. It pit Ukrainian forces against pro-Russian separatists. Several rounds of talks were held. They resulted in what's called the Minsk Agreements. Russia, Ukraine, France and Germany signed this Minsk Agreement in 2014 and then a second part of it in 2015. The agreements were meant to stop the war. Russia agreed to withdraw troops and weapons from Ukraine. Kiev agreed to hold elections in Donbas and grant the region a special status. Neither side kept its word. So 8 years on, Donbas stands devastated. 14,000 people have died in the past 8 years. 14,000. Families have been displaced. The area's economy has been destroyed. Today, pro-Russian separatists control 1/3 of Donbas. Ukraine considers this region as occupied by Russia. Moscow has been pushing for its autonomy. Ukraine wants to keep this region. There's been talk of granting Donbas a self-governing status. Now, 60% of Ukrainians are against it, according to a poll. A special status basically means elections, and elections mean pro-Russian parties will come to power here, and that would mean Russian influence on Ukraine's domestic and foreign policy. Ukraine says it may grant Donbas a special status, but for that, there must be a ceasefire first and a withdrawal of Russian troops and weaponry. Russia says all of this will happen only if Donbas is allowed to hold elections first. And this back and forth has been on for 8 years. It continues to this day. So that's the history. Right now, Russia is trying to change the status quo unilaterally. The passing of a proposal on Donbass is an example of that. Russia wants to recognize rebel leaders of Donbass and give them the status of legitimate rulers. What happens if Putin agrees to this proposal? What if he declares Donbass as a republic? There are 4 possible scenarios. Scenario number 1, Russia could invade Ukraine citing a threat to Donbass, and the groundwork for that is already being laid. A Russian news agency is headlining a possible threat to the region. Pro-Russian separatists are adding fuel to the fire. Listen to this.
The military leadership of the People's Militia of the Donetsk People's Republic observes preparations by the Ukrainian armed forces to unleash active combat operations in Donbass.
Recently, Ukraine was holding drills in Donbass. It was preparing to attack Donbass. Was it preparing, rather? It's highly unlikely. Scenario number 2, Russia could be using Donbass as a bargaining chip. It could promise reintegration of Donbass in exchange for Ukraine's NATO dreams. Scenario number 3, Russia could take these republics. It could take Donbass in exchange for de-escalation, basically redraw the map of Ukraine again. And scenario number 4, a full-fledged war could break out. If Putin declares the region a republic, it amounts to sounding the war bugle. What is the Russian president likely to do? Speaking earlier this evening, Vladimir Putin said Russia should do everything to resolve the problems of Donbass. Recognizing Donbass would mean claiming sovereignty over the entire Donetsk and Luhansk regions, including parts controlled by Ukraine. And that would be, like I've been saying, a serious provocation. How will Ukraine respond to it? What about the West? Well, one can only guess at this point. Basically, what happens in Donbass or what happens with regards to Donbass will determine what happens next. So this is a region you must watch very closely. We'll keep you posted on what happens here. And Russia versus America, we know, is not a new rivalry. It's a rerun of the 20th century. But this time, there is a big difference. This time there's a third player, and this third player has no stakes in Europe, no military presence, no strategic influence, not yet. But it's watching the standoff closely. I'm talking about China. What would China do if war breaks out? The past offers some clues. In 2014, when Putin annexed Crimea, China was on the fence. They did not recognize Russia's occupation. At the same time, they blamed the West for creating this crisis. And 2022, this year, could be a repeat of that. China cannot publicly endorse an invasion. They cannot support a war. What they can do is this: A, blame the West for instigating the crisis, and B, help Putin navigate Western sanctions. They've done it before, in 2014. And they will do it again if war breaks out. In fact, Chinese state media is already doing the groundwork for this. Let me show you some headlines. Here's what one of them says. US needs Ukraine crisis to legitimize its military presence in Europe. Here's another one. Instigating Ukraine crisis serves US interests. You see the pattern. And this will be China's first step. Blame the West. Step number 2 will be undermining Western sanctions. It's something of a Chinese speciality. America's rivals are China's business partners, whether it's Iran, Venezuela, or North Korea. We saw an indication of this at the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics. Vladimir Putin was also in attendance. He signed an important energy deal with Xi Jinping. China will buy oil and gas worth $117 billion from Russia. $117 billion. It's simple logic. If Europe shuts the tap, all of that Russian gas will have to go somewhere, and that somewhere could well be China. And the numbers support this plan. In 2021, China-Russia trade reached $146 billion. That was up almost 36% from 2020. So Xi and Putin are sinking their economy. Even Washington is aware of this plan.
If we see foreign companies, including those in China, doing their best to backfill U.S. export control actions, to evade them, to get around them. I wouldn't want to speculate on what those tools are, but we do have tools that can address that, and that would seek to account for that. That's a warning for Chinese companies. If you help Russia, we will target you.
The problem is, such threats may have worked in 2014. Back then, Chinese companies needed the Western market. Today, the equation has changed. China won't think twice before violating Western sanctions. But what's in it for them? Vladimir Putin is getting a market for his oil. He's getting relief from sanctions. What is Xi Jinping getting? Well, he's getting two things. Number one, a template for invading Taiwan. China is looking for America's weaknesses. How eagerly are they supporting Ukraine? What kind of weapons are they sending? Will US soldiers get involved? These answers will determine China's own plans for Taiwan. If America's response is weak, it will embolden China. Plus, it's a valuable distraction for them. In 2021, all the focus was on Beijing, on their genocide in Xinjiang, on their piracy in the South China Sea, and their attempts to cover up the Wuhan virus origins. But this crisis in Ukraine is a breather for China, a chance to plan a sneak attack. And once again, history offers clues. Let me take you back to 1962. The whole world was focused on the Caribbean. The Soviet Union was deploying ballistic missiles in Cuba. It was an existential threat for America. From Cuba, the Soviet Union could hit almost all of eastern US. Simply put, it was the closest the West came, or the world came, to nuclear Armageddon. Guess what was China doing in 1962? China was attacking India. Chinese troops advanced along the border. In the western sector, they attacked Ladakh, and in the east, they attacked the NEFA, the Northeast Frontier Agency. It was a surprise attack. We cannot rule out something similar this time. Maybe a move on Taiwan or something along the line of actual control. Who knows? That's benefit number one for China. Benefit number two, China is getting a much-needed Pacific partner. And this will entice Xi Jinping. He has more rivals than friends in the Indo-Pacific. The Quad, the AUKUS, the ASEAN, all of them are working against China. So Xi Jinping needs a Pacific ally. And who better than Vladimir Putin? Russia's Pacific coastline is 4,500 kilometers long. More importantly, it's a veteran naval power. Russia's Pacific Fleet was established in 1731, and Putin is not shy to deploy them. Last year, Russian and Chinese warships encircled Japan. Beijing called it business as usual, but Tokyo was spooked. They expressed concerns over this rare team-up. Chances are we'll see more such drills. It was evident after the meeting between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. Here's what their joint statement said, and I'll read out a part of it for you. Russia and China have made consistent efforts to build an equitable, open and inclusive security system in the Asia-Pacific region. They don't call it Indo-Pacific. Do you notice the difference in terminology? The Quad calls for an open, free and inclusive Indo-Pacific. Russia and China are calling for an open and inclusive security system. Their focus is not on trade or shipping. Their focus is on influence and power. So if Russia goes to war, China's policy is clear. Strike a balance in public and behind the scenes, keep the Russian economy afloat. It's a role reversal of sorts. In the late 1940s and early 50s, two giants ruled Russia and China, Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong. Back then, the equation was different. Stalin used to advise Mao. He used to pull the strings. He even kept Mao waiting in Moscow for weeks, humiliated him, treated him like the leader of a vassal state. This time, the roles have reversed. If Russia is to survive this game, Putin needs Xi Jinping, and that puts him in a vulnerable position. We'll be tracking that story. For the moment, we head to Pakistan, where a convicted murderer is about to walk free. His name is Wasim Azim, the brother of Qandeel Baloch, also a killer. For those of you who don't know about this case or don't remember about this case, Qandeel Baloch was a social media celebrity in Pakistan. She was famous for her rebellious lifestyle, which often challenged the prevailing societal norms in Pakistan. In July 2016, she was strangled to death by her own brother because he wanted to restore what he called his family's honor. 6 years on, the brother has been acquitted. His sentence has been overturned. Let that sink in. On what grounds? Our next report tells you.
She was Pakistan's first social media star. A figure of intense fascination and outrage. Some adored her for breaking social taboos. Others reviled her for her rebellious nature. They would call her Pakistan's Kim Kardashian, someone who lived on her own terms. The price she paid for doing so was her life. On the 15th of July 2016, Qandeel Baloch was strangled to death as she slept at her parents' home in Multan. It was an honor killing. Qandeel Baloch was killed by her own brother, Wasim Azim, who later said that he had no regrets or remorse because her sister's behavior was intolerable. Wasim was sentenced to life imprisonment, but barely 6 years on, he's about to walk free. He has been acquitted, cleared of all charges. How did this happen? No one knows. Reports say he has been pardoned by his family. Is that even legal? In Pakistan, it has been for quite some time. The Islamic law in Pakistan has long allowed a murder victim's family to pardon an accused. But that law has apparently been amended, so it's unclear how Wasim has been set free. A lawyer says this acquittal was prompted after key witnesses withdrew their testimonies. Whatever be the case, a heinous crime has been overturned and a convicted killer is being set free. The news has infuriated Pakistan's civil society. People are questioning the loopholes in the country's judicial system. They want the court order to be made public. Last we checked, the court had refused to give further details. This sets a wrong precedent. Pakistan has the highest number of documented honor killings per capita in the world. About 1/5 of the world's honor killings are committed here. That's about 1,000 honor killings out of the 5,000 per year globally. Women are killed for their relationships, their behavior, and their morality, perceived to be not in line with the fundamentalists. Qandeel Baloch was one such woman. She was shunned and killed for killing patriarchal norms. Her story and struggle should have propelled critical reforms in Pakistan. But the acquittal of her killer has proven that Pakistan and reform remain parallel roads.
Every country has a flagship export. Saudi Arabia has oil, Japan and Germany have cars, Sri Lanka has tea, and Canada has anti-vax freedom convoys. Frankly, it's becoming hard to keep track. France, Germany, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, there's a freedom convoy everywhere. But as always, there is only one original, and that is Canada. Justin Trudeau's worst fears are coming true. Weapons are making their way into the convoy. On Monday, Canadian police arrested 11 protesters near the US border. They were carrying rifles, handguns, body armors, and machetes. Anti-vaxxers were already scary. Now they're carrying lethal weapons. Does Trudeau have a plan to contain them? He says he does. The plan is an all-out offensive. Justin Trudeau is invoking emergency powers. Now, these are sweeping provisions. Trudeau can prohibit assembly, he can ban travel, he can order evacuations, he can also take over private resources like pickup trucks or tow trucks. These powers are granted for 30 days. But there's a strict process before implementing it. The emergency must be approved by the Parliament. This can be done in 4 situations. Number 1, for public welfare. Number 2, to bring public order. Number 3, international emergencies. And 4, war. Trudeau's government is using the second situation to bring public order. The Parliament has 2 choices now: approve the emergency or reject it. And this decision must be made within 7 days. We cannot emphasize how rare this move is. Only once has Canada imposed an emergency. That was in 1970. And guess who imposed it? A certain Pierre Trudeau, Justin's father. Pierre Trudeau imposed an emergency to fight separatists in Quebec. He deployed tanks and soldiers. Trudeau Jr., though, is not going that far.
We're not using the Emergencies Act to call in the military. We're not suspending fundamental rights or overriding the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We are not limiting people's freedom of speech. We are not limiting freedom of peaceful assembly. We are not preventing people from exercising their right to protest legally. We are reinforcing the principles, values, and institutions that keep all Canadians free.
How is Canada reacting to Trudeau's move? Well, there are two opinions. One section says he is too late already, that Trudeau should have acted sooner. Another section asks, why bother at all? The protesters will gradually get bored and leave. Either way, this decision is bound to trigger debate. An emergency is not like a normal crackdown. You're suspending democracy. You're pressing pause on freedoms. Trudeau says it's a measure of last resort.
Invoking the Emergencies Act is never the first thing a government should do, nor even the second. The Act is to be used sparingly and as a last resort. Right now, the situation requires additional tools not held by any other federal, provincial, or territorial law.
As things stand, Trudeau has no other option. The protesters are carrying guns. They're turning up in full body armor. If he does not crack down now, things may escalate. But why did Trudeau let things go out of hand? Why did he let the freedom convoy grow? He could have taken a stance in January, either ban the protests or reach out to them. Instead, he did nothing. He let the freedom convoy grow. And for the record, Trudeau has done this before. Let me take you back to 2020. Canada was witnessing its largest railway blockade. The issue was a proposed gas pipeline. According to the proposal, the pipeline would cut through indigenous land. In response, there were railway blockades. Trudeau's response was the same. In Parliament, he called for patience, but 4 days later, he cracked down on the blockades. Around 10 protesters were arrested. Do you see the problem here? Justin Trudeau is indecisive. He seems unable to read developing situations. What constitutes a peaceful protest? Public nuisance. Trudeau did not figure that out. In 2022, he repeated the same mistake. Polls in Canada suggest the same. Around 72% protesters must go home, but around 65%. Trudeau made the situation worse. Leaders are eager to avoid his mistake. They have made up their mind. Only crackdown. Take a look. Honestly, neither scenario is perfect. Protesters hold up daily life is wrong. If they're anti-vaxxers, worse. But so is using violence on peaceful demonstrators. So how do you strike a balance? Perhaps talks first, then crack down. Now, we don't have a playbook on handling protests. Every country is different. Every protest is different. But Justin Trudeau has given us a playbook on what not to do. Now, they say politicians will do anything for votes. A presidential candidate in South Korea is redefining what that means. He has created a digital avatar of himself to sway voters. A deepfake model to make himself appear, quote-unquote, cooler. The name of this man is Yoon Suk-yeol. He is being called the world's first deepfake candidate because his digital avatar is finding more traction than his real self. The story is strange. You have to watch our next report to fully understand it.
Meet Yoon Suk-yoon, a South Korean attorney, a former public prosecutor and now a presidential candidate. But the man you're seeing right now is not really him. It's AI Yoon, his digital avatar, a deepfake model made with hours of specially recorded footage. What for? To make this middle-aged politician look cool. How exactly? By arming him with salty language, witty answers and meme-ready quips. All in a bid to engage young voters who get most of their news online. This concept is gaining traction in South Korea, which has the world's fastest average internet speeds. The creators say it's set to be used more and more in future elections.
It's so easy to create huge amounts of content with deepfake technology as long as staffers spend some time on it. It is inevitable that this will be used more and more in future elections.
AI Yoon is the world's first official deepfake candidate. With neatly combed hair and a smart suit, it looks uncannily similar to the real Yoon. Only that it's more humorous, more charming and less politically correct. It mockingly refers to the South Korean President Moon Jae-in as Moon Ding Dong and his rival Lee Jae-myung as Lee Ding Dong. The answers may seem to be impromptu, but they're written by his campaign team. They've built this avatar through 3,000 sentences and 20 hours of audio and video stored in their database. They framed the replies by drawing on millennial lingo and pop culture references currently trending in South Korea. This is challenging carefully honed rhetoric usually found in public policy debates.
We try to handle some of the questions that the candidate cannot answer. In addressing some of those questions, we sometimes encounter contents that are not necessarily politically correct. But if we try too hard not to cross the line, there are relatively less feedbacks from the public.
Rival candidates accuse the AI Yoon team of downgrading political decorum. But their snark appears to be working. It's been a huge hit, attracting millions of views since making its debut. It has even turned the elections into a neck-and-neck battle. Yoon has pulled way ahead of his rivals with voters in their 20s. But where does he plan to draw the line? Deepfake technology is a double-edged sword. It can blur the lines between reality and illusion. Does a giggle-inducing digital avatar qualify someone to be a statesman? Do sensational answers scripted beforehand outweigh a politician's ability to perform? South Koreans will be grappling with these questions when they cast their vote.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is on a reconciliation tour. On Monday, he was in the UAE, his first visit since 2013. Erdogan's mission was straightforward: rebuild Turkey's relations with the Arab world. In Abu Dhabi, he was welcomed by Crown Prince Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. They held talks, they signed 13 agreements and announced a new era of friendship. Why is this visit significant? Because the UAE was Erdogan's bitter rival. It all started with the Arab Spring of 2011. Erdogan supported the Muslim Brotherhood and Sunni Islamists. He plotted to overthrow the Gulf monarchies. And since then, Turkey and the UAE have been enemies. Take any regional conflict, Turkey and the UAE will be in opposite camps, whether it's Libya, Eastern Mediterranean or East Africa. In 2016, this rivalry peaked. Erdogan was nearly ousted in a bloody coup attempt. He survived, but he accused the UAE of funding the coup. On Monday, though, we saw none of that animosity. This was Erdogan, the charmer.
Today we do not trust the Kiev regime. Now it is out of control and impossible to reach agreements with them. Ukraine is now led by fascists, right sector nationalists and supporters of Anglo-Saxon countries. By making this proposal, we do only one thing. We offer protection to the people.
In 2011, he was trying to oust the monarchy. Today, he's calling them visionary. What changed? Turkey's economy. The UAE is one of West Asia's financial powerhouses. Turkey, on the other hand, is in the dumps. Their currency, the lira, has plunged 44% since last year. Annual inflation is nearly 50%. To make matters worse, there are Western sanctions. With elections next year, Erdogan must act. If he does not rescue the economy, he could be voted out. So what's his plan? The plan is to woo the Arab world, to use Arab money to revive Turkey's economy. Step one of the plan was in November 2021. Turkey hosted the UAE's Crown Prince. He promised investments worth $10 billion. Step two was today's visit. 13 agreements were signed in Abu Dhabi. They cover defense, trade, climate change and industry. You can see what Erdogan is trying to do. Hit two birds with one stone. A, he gets money from the Arab nations, and B, he can rebuild ties with the US. That is Erdogan's larger plan, to lift Western sanctions, to get into Joe Biden's good books. And to do that, he's wooing every US ally in West Asia. Yesterday, he was in Abu Dhabi. Rumor is he will visit Saudi Arabia next. And in March, he will host Israel's president. In all these dealings, Erdogan's gains are clear. More investments, fewer sanctions. But what's in it for the Arab world? The UAE wants to become a transit hub. And for that, they need land access to Turkey via Iran. This corridor already exists. It cuts the shipment time from 21 days to 7. Abu Dhabi wants to expand this corridor. And secondly, war weariness is creeping in. Conflicts have always been a constant feature of West Asia. In Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, conflicts are the permanent scheme. Most countries are eager to change this dynamic. Hence the changing equations. Just think about it. The blockade on Qatar has been lifted. Arab nations are talking to Syria's Bashar al-Assad. One by one, they're recognizing Israel. And Saudi Arabia and Iran are holding talks. All of this symbolizes a desire for stability. It's good for the region, but there are some challenges. How many of these outreaches are genuine? Would Erdogan court the UAE if his economy was doing well? Chances are he wouldn't. And that's precisely the problem. Leaders like Erdogan will host Israel's president, yet fund the Hamas. He will praise the UAE's monarchy, yet support Islamists. In a land infamous for betrayals, such double games can prove to be deadly. Our final report for the night is a little disturbing, even borderline bizarre. A security camera has captured some unusual footage. Thousands of birds are seen falling from the sky. They're dropping dead. It happened in Mexico, and people around the world are having a hard time explaining this incident. Take a look.
What you will see next is disturbing. This is the footage from a security camera. Watch what happens next. The video is not fake. This happened in Mexico. Birds fell from the sky and dropped dead. Spooky, right? It happens in novels of Haruki Murakami. Fish fall from the sky. Leeches fall from the sky. It's magical realism, not reality. So what explains what this camera captured? It happened on the 7th of February. The sidewalks were flooded with dead birds. People started looking for clues. One netizen said the birds flew through power lines. Another blamed electromagnetic radiation, the so-called frequency warfare. We wish we knew what she meant. One Twitter user said the birds could have inhaled toxic gases. The birds that died were all migratory. They traveled to Mexico from Canada every year. But something like this has never happened before. One netizen seems to believe there were magnetic field issues. What kind exactly? The conspiracy theory kind. Actor Channing Tatum has given the mysterious incident a political twist. He says this is what happens when people follow a leader blindly. The local paper that first reported the incident blames pollution. What do experts say? They say what happened was murmurating. Let's look at the footage again. The birds were apparently trying to escape a predator. In that process, few hit the ground and died. Channing Tatum was right. The birds did not realize they were going to hit the ground because they were following the leader blindly. This has happened before. In 2020, for example, some 200 starlings were found dead on a road in North Wales. Post-mortem reports showed severe internal trauma. It was later concluded that the bird struck the ground while trying to escape a predator. That explains this scary footage. And it is better than believing aliens have begun flushing birds from the sky. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
With that, it's a wrap. We're leaving you with Gravitas images. Thanks for watching. Stay safe.
The second umbilical tower is now separating. And liftoff. Liftoff of Progress 80. Good chamber pressure reported on the first stage. And separation.